Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. Last week, American voters sent congressional Democrats to a crushing defeat. Does this lopsided election signal a major realignment in American politics? Or was it simply a natural swing of the electoral pendulum? Joining us to sort through the conflict and the consensus are E.J. Dionne, a resident scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and author of Why Americans Hate Politics; Michael Vlahos, senior fellow at the Progress and Freedom Foundation; Carlin Bowman, a colleague of mine and a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute; and Stephen Hess, senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and author of Live from Capitol Hill, Studies of Congress and the Media. The topic before this House, the 1994 elections. Is this the end of an era? This week on Think Tank. Why did Americans vote the way they did, and where does this election fit in American electoral history? Is it a post-New Deal realignment, the rise of neo-populism, or did fed-up voters just want to throw the bums out? Nasty, aggressive, and very expensive election campaigns were the rule on both sides in 1994. But American voters turned out to register their displeasure chiefly with the Democrats. The Republicans picked up well over the necessary 40 seats to wrest control of the House from the Democrats for the first time in 40 years. In the Senate, Republicans gained 8 seats. Across the country, powerful politicians lost to upstarts. Voters in the 5th District of Washington ejected Speaker of the House Tom Foley. Dan Rostenkowski's Chicago voters ousted him after 36 years. Some threatened Democrats, such as Ted Kennedy, Charles Robb, and Dianne Feinstein, held on to their seats. But in January, Republican Bob Dole will be the majority leader of the Senate, and Newt Gingrich will be the next Speaker of the House. E.J. Dionne, was this election an earthquake, a tidal wave, a so-called realigning election that you, as a young man, will have to live with the consequences for the rest of your life?
Well, I think it was a tidal wave, but like a lot of tidal waves, you don't quite know what the effects are going to be when it hits. I think part of it, especially in the South, was part of a continuing realignment toward the Republicans, and I think part of it was an expression of discontent that's been out there for some years and could continue to take different forms as time goes on.
Steve?
Well, obviously, any election that produces a Republican House for the first time in 40 years has to be at least a tidal wave. I think I may be a good deal more skeptical than some of my colleagues about realignment. An electorate that throws out Republicans 2 years ago and elects Democrats 2 years later, throws out the Democrats that they've just elected and elects Republicans. Well, who knows what they're going to do 2 years from now.
Carlin?
Tidal wave, tsunami, watershed, I'm not sure what the appropriate word is, but I'm not sure I'll see another election like this in my lifetime. The last time the Republicans won a majority of the popular vote for the House was 1946.
That's almost half a century ago.
That's right. Major change.
Michael?
Well, it could be a realignment, and it could be the beginning of a long Republican stewardship. But that is going to have to be up to them to create the vision that follows the shift in Congress. This happened in the 1890s, and that's Newt's favorite period, and he brings up Mark Hanna a lot. In the 1890s, you'd had Democrats controlling Congress for 9 out of the 10 Congresses before that, and then suddenly it shifted by almost 100 seats, more than 100 seats in 1895, and that was followed up the next year by a watershed presidential election, which decided the course for the country.
That was William Jennings Bryan versus
and McKinley, and basically
versus McKinley, right?
Basically, you had a struggle going on between backward-looking populists and forward-looking sort of immigrant, urban, industrial Republicans, and the Republicans won out and set up 35 years of dominance.
So what you're saying is that this may well be a realigning election only if a Republican wins in 1996.
No, only if the Republicans capture a vision. And
capture
that, of course,
a vision.
Yeah, they could win in '96 and still blow it.
Well, I understand. But
you know.
if a Republican president wins and they in '96 and they keep control of both houses, Steve, would you then
Well, yeah,
would you
when
then
you
be
talk-
convinced that?
Yeah, sure, because you've got to have an event. When you talk about realignments, we talk about Jackson, we talk about what happened in 1828.
Andrew, not Scoop.
Andrew, not Scoop. You talk about a realignment that was the Civil War. You talk about the realignment that Michael talked about with monetary and industrial policy after the panic of 1893. You talk about the Great Depression producing an alignment. I don't think that there is a comparable issue today. I know Michael disagrees with me, but he does it by collecting a variety
Issues
of...
are
I
always
think,
there.
Michael's right in picking the 1890s as a relevant period, but I'm not sure we know it comes out quite that way, because I think
Yeah.
what we're going through now as a country is a kind of series of crises related to globalization, technological change, that's creating a lot of uneasiness among voters. It's the same kind of uneasiness that happened during industrialization in the period from the Civil War to the 1900s. You can talk about the realignment toward the Republicans with William McKinley, but that was also followed immediately by the Progressive era. And I think you can make a case that the country could move in one of two directions. It could move toward a kind of conservative vision, or it could move towards something like the Progressives did in terms of an era of reform, including social reform.
You talked about the globalization of the economy and technological change, and I want to ask you all what caused the voters to vote as they did, but I want to mention one or two polls beforehand so you might get a slight clue as to what I think. Shortly before the election, a Washington Post, ABC, EJ, you worked for the Washington Post, a Washington Post ABC poll showed 68% of the public regarded social issues as the most important problem, while only 13% said it was economic issues.
But don't confuse the two. I mean, we're in a period of economic transformation, just like the 1890s, and the social dislocation that comes out of economic transformation is the issue that affects people. Their lives are being torn
Hey,
apart.
look, this
And
social
that's what's
issue
going
stuff,
on.
I was just reading Barry Goldwater's 1964
Right.
speech to the convention. He lists out the crime and the welfare and all of these social issues as if it was contemporary. This didn't just start.
No, it didn't, but
Right.
now it's being...
That's 30 years ago.
I agree with you, and it didn't just start in 1896 either. That whole industrial transformation had been going on for decades, and the country, if you remember the labor disturbances of 1876, all of the depressions that went on, there were 3 depressions in the 1890s, it culminates over a period of time, and what we're seeing is that people are finally confronting a real watershed in their lives, and the economic transformation, which we can call globalization, information revolution, is all bound up in a change in American life. Americans are very uncertain. They're looking for a vision of where we go from here.
Let's
then I
talk
think-
about the micro picture, though. We can get
Okay,
too
sure.
macro about that. We've just gone through an election where the polls, the most recent Washington Post poll, showed that 3 out of 4 Americans couldn't name their member of Congress, where 2 out of 3 Americans who are eligible to vote didn't vote,
Right.
where we have a uniquely unpopular president, where 25% of the people simply detest him. And detest him in a way that's very interesting. When they detest Ronald Reagan, it was ideological, so there was a comparable group that loved him. There's no comparable group here. These are really very unique situations in which I think we have to be very gentle in looking into the...
you
into
Ben,
the-
I think you're,
Go ahead,
I think
Carl.
you're right that issues involving moral disintegration of the society are weighing very heavily on people's minds. And if you look back to the 50s, the last time this happened, Americans were concerned about our science and technology. Could we compete with the Soviets? And now the overwhelming concern in the polls that I see is about moral fiber. I mean, and that has many dimensions. It has economic dimensions. Are we going to be able to compete with other people in Southeast Asia, for example? But it also has a great deal to do with the problems we have here at home, the ones that we are not very confident that government can solve.
See, I
And
think-
that's a sea change.
Look, Steve, you said it was unique, a unique election in part because Clinton was so detested by so many people.
Yeah, so to that degree, it is a vote of confidence. I mean,
Well, but wait a minute,
the
wait a minute,
beloved
wait a minute,
Tip
but
O'Neill
if-
was not right that all politics is local.
Right, but-
Neither is all politics national. But there was an awful lot that had to do with Bill Clinton
Yeah,
in this
but-
election.
but
And Bill
hold-
Clinton
yeah,
isn't
but-
going
but-
to be around forever.
You're telling me, but suppose, I mean, isn't there an ideological component to not liking a politician? Suppose Clinton had governed as a New Democrat. He got all the liberals angry. He coalesced with the Republicans in the center. In other words, he governed the way he ran as a New Democrat. I think 3/4 of those people who hate him would be hailing him.
Well, what if it goes beyond ideology? I mean, what if the old paradigm, to use a 25-cent word, of government, bureaucratic, enlightened state that came out of the progressive era, what if that just doesn't work anymore? And in this period of economic transformation, people see that it doesn't work, and they want to throw it out.
Would you accept this distinction, that it is not simply an anti-government vote, but it is an anti-what government does vote?
And an anti-bureaucratic state vote, because the bureaucratic state is collapsing in business. Businesses are not like IBM and GM used to be, pyramids. They are now adopting a totally different architecture of relationship, and that's going into government. And what's happening in this election is a reflection
But
of
I
that.
think Republicans have to answer the question about whether this was an anti-Washington vote or an anti-government vote. And I don't think that that's clear. For example, if you look at a lot of Republican governors who are elected, they think government can do many things and they can do it well. They streamline government. It's a smaller government generally. But I think Republicans have to answer that question about what the mood is about the city of Washington.
And Carlin is right about in pointing to the governors, because if you look at the governor's elections, you didn't have a lot of incumbents thrown out, with a couple of notable exceptions like Mario Cuomo, and the range of governors who were reelected.
And Ann Richards.
And Ann Richards, yes.
Right.
But the range of governors reelected, they tended to be, with a couple of exceptions, quite a moderate lot. On the Democratic side, Roy Romer of Colorado, Dean in Vermont. You had people, and then on the Republican side, you had people like Voinovich or Jim Edgar. These are problem-solving governors, and I think
you didn't have a lot of senators thrown out either. You had Sasser and Wofford, 2 senators thrown out. In other words, look what happened there. George Mitchell decided he wanted to be commissioner of baseball or something else. He would have been reelected. The seat went Republican.
Boren would have been
Boren wanted to be governor, wanted to be president of Oklahoma State University.
Boren may run primaries as
Okay,
against Clinton,
he
in my
would have
judgment,
won.
right.
If Lloyd Benson hadn't decided he preferred to be Secretary of Treasury, he would be in the Senate.
Al Gore.
You know, Al Gore. So, we could be sitting here today looking at a situation in which there's
Steve,
a perfectly
but
logical...
This is part of what happens in
Well,
Washington a lot, and this
yeah.
is one of the things you saw before the election. People thought, and I looked at the last Cuomo push, for example. It was a whole hour, and they thought that having all sorts of famous actors endorsing him, trying to really manipulate and control people from the old standpoint of this ruling elite in Washington knowing how to control elections, and it blew apart this time.
Can't you just conclude that somebody, after being in office for 12 years, is worn out? That it wasn't it wasn't a massive question of industrialization, but just that the people of New York were tired
I'm sure
of
people
Mario?
in the 1890s would
Steve,
have
when
accepted
all the
interpretation.
dominoes, or almost all the dominoes, you point to specific things. Cuomo was 12 years, and
that's
Lloyd
how
Benson and Al
politics
Gore.
is. It's a lot of little pieces we put
But
together
you could
and make
put
a
a lot
whole.
of little pieces on the other side. But when all the dominoes, or almost all the dominoes, fall in the same direction, particularly in those open seats where there's no incumbency advantage, and they all go roughly the same way, I would say, you better start talking realignment. This is big time stuff, particularly when you have that lurking values issue that the Democrats
But
had a
you
shot
started
at, and
off by
Clinton
saying
blew
that
it.
the Republicans are saying what Barry Goldwater said. All you did is have a party that takes the
But I think
majority.
we-
That's not realignment. That's that the party has been successful in basically what it stands for. It is a conservative party.
I also think one of the things we're going to have to look at more closely over time is what was the nature of the turnout in this election. See, I think that Clinton and the Democrats have a very large internal problem, that they got beat because they couldn't come together around a coherent program of government. And I think voters were angry about that, independent of their ideological position, although there is certainly some ideological component to it. And that Clinton's problem in terms of his unpopularity is that if you think of the group that's benefited most from the recovery, they are by and large better off people because they were in a better position to benefit from the recovery. They didn't like Clinton because he raised their taxes, or they were Republicans. The people who would have been the natural Democrats, and I think many of them didn't vote, were the people who haven't felt the recovery yet. So this side is disappointed, and the other side doesn't like Clinton's
That's
policy.
always what happens in real
Speaking
life.
of this side of this panel is the technocratic side. All right, they say, well, there was all these
I
little
would never accept that.
these little Rube Goldberg machines, and it didn't quite work. We didn't quite get turnout, and we have some
Oh no, I don't think it's a Rube
ideologues over
no,
here.
no, I don't think it's a Rube Goldberg problem. I don't think this is pulling a few levers. I think this is really a deep matter of how can Democrats govern the country. New Democrats have said, you've got to restructure the government, you've got to do a bunch of things differently. So-called old Democrats have said, we've got to solve some problems and use government. Clinton promised a synthesis, which was, we're going to reform government, that's the New Democrat side, and we're going to use it, that's
But
the
his
old
manifest-
Democrat
his
side.
manifest-
Hold on, I want to hear from some of the ideologues here.
Can I defend
Carlin,
myself, though,
Carlin,
quickly?
was this a election a rise of conservatism, sort of round two of the Reagan Revolution?
I think we've seen a rolling realignment, and I think the country is becoming more conservative over time, and though you don't see that in the straight ideology numbers, but certainly you see that, I think, in the election that we had last week.
It's a different kind of conservatism, though. It's not fiscal conservatism. It's not let's be 20% less than the Democrats. It's not let's be 20% less than FDR. It's a different kind of vision. You talked about governors. It's because people want to see power devolve to more local arenas. And when you look at realignments in the past, at the time it occurs, it never seems as obvious as it does in retrospect. And basically, if you look at, you saw the Times Mirror survey, for example, you have different groups and constellation of voters moving away from their former affiliations. The fact that Clinton was such a manifest failure in his promise to keep the old coalition together is a sign of how far things have gone. You have a whole group of Perotistas, basically, who are right there to be grabbed by the Republicans. You have a divide that isn't simply a divide of ideology. It's a divide of whether you look backward to the bureaucratic state or forward to a different concept of American life.
I
Wait,
would write that
hold
speech,
on,
though,
I-
for Eisenhower, though. I mean, really, seriously.
It's
seriously.
what did you say, Steve?
I say I was writing that speech for Eisenhower.
Oh, you still don't get it.
Let me say, is it not true that in the South, at least, as EJ started a discussion, this is a continuation, the completion of a
Started in 48.
certainly in 52, when Eisenhower took Texas and Florida and Virginia. So we had it at the presidential level. Then it moved to the gubernatorial and senatorial. Now
I
it's
should
at the
point
House
out to our,
level. We have a
audience that
completed- we have a
Stephen
com-
Hess,
Yeah.
although he's a man young, shorted tooth, a young man started working in the Eisenhower administration. He was 3. But and then you worked in the Nixon administration.
Your micro-interpretation is very persuasive at the micro level, but you have to understand, I would hope, that there are these periods when things shift and break in America.
But Michael,
And to deny that that's
predictions-
happening,
No.
you know,
Predictions. I predict that tomorrow will be like today on realignments, which means that I'm only wrong once every 40 years.
Right.
I may be wrong now.
Okay.
But the odds, at least, are.
Could I throw one more
Go
element
ahead,
into
sure.
the pot? This is about a voter who realigned in this election. I was on the phone with one of my oldest friends, a historic Democrat who voted straight Republican on Tuesday. And he said he walked into his polling place and he saw a lot of people hanging around, mostly guys, he said, mostly middle-aged guys. And he said these are people with kids. They were worried about bringing up their families. They thought it's their responsibility to do that. And he thinks a lot of these people voted Republican simply as an expression of their deep belief that a certain kind of personal responsibility should rule, and that the government isn't going to solve the problems that's in their
You
heads.
just hit it.
I
Personal
think that-
responsibility is
I
the
think
watchword
that
of the-
is-
Did he move to the suburbs?
Well, yes, and
No,
exactly
wait,
right.
EJ,
These, I
this-
pointed out to
this
him,
is-
these were people who didn't need government at all,
This is a
and
really
that's the
important point,
issue.
though. This is a
That's
really important
exactly
point.
right.
That's the watchword of the
Government
future.
isn't even
is
helping
individ-
those people who need it, and I think that's one of the most serious problems, and that's what part of this election was about. It's not helping people who need it, and people want to see responsibilities devolved to the states and local areas where more can be done. New federalism may be back. Richard Nixon, long after his.
Individual
Hold on.
responsibility-
Let me just turn to something else. Who is going to be the next president and why? Carlin, you can tell us that. I know that.
I wish I knew the answer. I don't know the answer to that
How
question.
many people are going to be running?
Well, I think you could see a couple of independent candidacies. I think you could see Clinton challenge from both the right and the left of his party.
Who would challenge from the right and the left?
Casey in Pennsylvania. That there's been some talk about that he
From
might
the-
challenge from the right. Jesse Jackson could run as an independent. There's been some suggestion that David Boren could run as an independent. Colin Powell. No one knows yet whether he's a Republican or a
problem with
Democrat.
Bob Kerry, we hear it might challenge Clinton.
Possibly. And the Republicans have obviously a very large group, and it's hard to for me to
Yeah.
see who wins.
The Republicans have 2 years to put together a vision, and whoever best offers that vision most forcefully and most authentically will be the nominee.
I'd like to believe that, but I said I'd like to believe that, but I think that who has a lot of money at the beginning of this process?
Hey,
because
we
the
all know that.
primary
We're still-
process
but let me finish on
Is
this,
the
though, yeah?
Contract for America a vision?
The Contract for America is something that was a kind of a groundwork and a first step, but I think you've got to go a lot farther than that. You've got to talk about what's really happening to America. But on the Democrat side, if Clinton moves to the New Democrat to outflank the Republicans, you're going to see a third-party candidacy probably, and you're going to see
By
the
Jesse Jackson.
Democrats split up.
Right.
So that's a real interesting prospect for the next election.
First of all, I think Clinton could still be the next president. I think
Yes.
we are in such a strange and volatile mood that I do not think we should rule that out
No,
as of
absolutely
now.
not. Wow.
But I think on the Republican side, a lot of people are going to end up looking at these governors, because I think it's very important to see this election as a reaction against Democrats in Washington, but not against incumbents in the state houses, with those couple of exceptions. And that somebody like Lamar Alexander is out there, I think, talking in very interesting terms about how do you assemble a new Republican program. In fact, he's gone back to the progressive era too, and is talking about Herbert Crowley and what does a new Republican program look like. I think that's very
EJ, is it
interesting.
possible
Well,
for those Republicans to
I
run
would
as favorite
say, I would
sons?
say that Clinton.
Hold on, let's get
sorry.
Carlin's question. We'll come to
My
you.
question to EJ is, could these Republican governors run as favorite sons? Because the primary process is over so early this time, about 65% of the delegates
People
are
won't
selected
buy
by
that
March?
anymore. That was
Yeah.
the
They
way
just
it
won't
used to
buy
be
it?
before 1952. Yeah, that's
I think
throwing
that's
away
very
your vote.
hard.
It's interesting.
But
it-
could they
it's not gonna-
agree to think about it as a group?
But you
and
could have
I mean, it's just an interesting idea.
It's an
it
interesting
is
question in the
interesting.
sense that they wouldn't be favorite sons in the old sense, but Pete Wilson could well carry California, Bill Weld could well carry Massachusetts and New
Exactly.
Hampshire,
Christy Whitman.
so you would have the effect
What-
of favorite sons
what
without
about
real
some of-
favorite
What about
sons.
some of those Midwestern governors who are so popular? I mean,
Engler, Thompson.
Engler, Thompson.
Yeah, they're all good vice presidential candidates.
Yeah,
Yeah,
he's got-
and
Only-
therefore, couldn't they
only-
say to their voters, look, let me represent you out there. I'm only running in this state. There are so many votes, so many convention votes here. Don't vote for any of those guys. Vote for me, and have a real convention.
I would argue that if Colin Powell turns out to be a Republican, he'll be the Republican nominee. And it's not a vision we're looking for, but it's a leader. We haven't got 2 years for vision.
They go together.
I would
Let's
say,
remember
I would say
every time in
that
America.
Bill Clinton, although he's likely to get the nomination, is also a possibility to be the first incumbent president since Chester Arthur in 1884 to be denied the nomination. Want to play games? We can play it. We can play it either
All
way.
right, let's. We started with EJ on a sort of round robin. Let us try that again as we close this discussion. What do you distill from this conversation that you agree upon and disagree upon as a panel here? How would you
I think-
sum up what we have just heard?
I think we agree that these elections were a big deal, and we don't quite agree on what that deal means. I think that there is a sense that something is roiling the country out there. I think everybody agrees on
Values,
that.
EJ.
Yeah, I knew you'd say that.
Yeah, I know you knew it. Right.
And I think values is part of it. I think the kind of economic change we're going through is part of it and affects the values. I think where we disagree is about how clear the direction of this change is. My own view is that we're in the middle of it, and it's not clear, at least to me, what direction this change is going to take.
Steve.
Well, I certainly think in the short run, the next 2 years, that the president blocked in terms of a legislative program is going to be, ironically, the foreign policy president and the reinvent
Yes,
government
absolutely
president.
right.
And that otherwise we'll go into the 1996 election looking for vision on both sides. The vision that EJ suggests for Clinton sort of coming down the middle, I think is much too subtle.
Carlin,
nuanced
how do
for
you
most
distill what we have learned this morning?
I agree with the agreement that we've just discussed thus far, but I think that the contract is a vision, albeit an imperfect one, and there is some ground for Republicans to try to change things in the city. But it's a very imperfect vision at this point.
This was the last hurrah of the progressive movement, and a historical era is finally over in American politics that was protracted far too long. And whether or not you see the Republicans rise with a new vision that carries them forward for 35 years of dominance or not, you're still at the end of an old era and the beginning of a new one.
I agree. We are at the end of an era, which, as Carlin knows, I've been saying for how long? 15 years that you've known me.
You finally
It's always a transition. We're always in the middle of a transition.
All right. Thank you, Stephen Hess, Carlin Bowman, E.J. Dionne, and Michael Vlahos. and thank you. We enjoy hearing from our audience. Please continue to send your comments to New River Media, 1150 17th Street, Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036, or we can be reached via email at thinktv@aol.com. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.